In the early campaigns of the Pacific War, when American Marines first stepped onto the black volcanic sands and coral beaches of islands with names few had ever heard before, they quickly learned that their greatest enemy was not always the Japanese soldier. The jungle itself fought them. The ocean fought them. The very ground fought them. The Pacific was a place where weapons rusted faster than they fired, where saltwater crept into every spring and hinge, where sand as fine as flour slipped into bolts and chambers and seized metal like a vice. Rifles that worked flawlessly in American training fields choked after one night in the wet heat of Guadalcanal. Machine guns that roared with power on the firing range grew sluggish after a single blast of seawater from a landing craft. Even the rugged M1 Garand sometimes struggled. Sandstorms on Tarawa jammed actions. Mud in Cape Clouster clung so thick to weapons that Marines scraped their rifles with knives just to make them cycle. The Pacific punished every weapon without mercy. It was in this brutal world that the Marines encountered a shotgun that seemed almost unnatural in its resilience. A weapon that was not supposed to survive such conditions, yet shrugged them off every time. The Ithaca Model 37. When Marines first received the Ithaca, they did not think much of it. It was smaller than the Garand and lacked the imposing weight of the Thompson. It was simple and unassuming. But on the beaches, during the first chaotic minutes of an amphibious landing, when the air was filled with smoke and screaming, and seawater crashed over the gunwales of Higgins' boats, the Marines made a discovery that spread through the ranks with lightning speed. The Ithaca 37 did not jam. Not when a wave dumped saltwater directly into the receiver. Not when wet sand coated the action like gravel. Not when the gun was dropped in mud thick enough to swallow a man's boot. Not even when Marines pumped it with hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. The shotgun simply worked. The secret lay in its design. Unlike most pump-action shotguns of the era, the Ithaca 37 ejected spent shells straight downwards. There was no open port on the side for sand to pour into, no place for seawater to pool. The action was sealed tighter than Marines had ever seen. The mechanism was based on an earlier design by John Browning, a name Marines trusted even if they did not know why. They only knew that, when everything else failed, the Ithaca did not. On the reefs of Tarawa, when Marines waded through waist-deep water under machine gun fire, some men held their rifles over their heads to keep them dry. Others tried to wrap them in ponchos as they slogged toward shore, but the men armed with Ithaca 37s did not bother. They simply kept pumping, water flowing out the barrel with each cycle until they reached the sand and began firing. One Marine later said, "If it fires once, it fires forever." During the early battles on Guadalcanal, Marines lived in rain that fell for days at a time. Their foxholes filled to the brim. Weapons rusted so quickly that rifles had to be cleaned twice a day. But the Ithaca often sat beside its owner for hours, soaked and forgotten, only to be lifted and fired without hesitation when a patrol of Japanese soldiers tested the perimeter at night. Engineers in the States had never intended the Ithaca 37 to become a front-line weapon. It was a police shotgun, a guard weapon, a tool for close-range defense. No one imagined it would become a lifesaver in jungles filled with hidden bunkers and caves. But war chooses its own heroes, and the Marines quickly discovered that the Ithaca 37 was the one weapon they could rely on when nothing else around them could be trusted. Reports began to reach command posts. After-action logs noted its reliability in harsh conditions. Quartermasters requested more. Raiders and scout units asked specifically for the 37, not the Stevens, not the Winchester, not the Remington. Letters home described it as the shotgun that will not die. Marines operating in the dense kunai grass of New Britain told stories of falling face first into swamp water, clawing themselves out and firing immediately at shapes moving in the foliage. The Ithaca cycled without complaint. Others described firefights in pitch-black nights, where rain fell so hard that rifles and machine guns sputtered, while the Ithaca thundered like a personal storm in the jungle. But perhaps the strongest impressions came from the landings. Every operation began the same way. A boat slamming through surf, sand and salt blasting into open equipment, men gripping their weapons as water poured over them. Weapon failures meant death in those moments, and the Marines never forgot which guns betrayed them and which guns did not. One Marine rifleman wrote in his journal after Peleliu, "The only thing you can trust out here is the man next to you and the Ithaca." In the Pacific, weapons were judged not by theory or design, but by survival. Could it fire after being dragged across coral? Could it operate after a monsoon? Could it cycle after being buried in volcanic ash? The Ithaca 37 answered yes, every time. As the war intensified and the Marines found themselves fighting in darker, tighter, and more hostile terrain, the reputation of the Ithaca only grew. It stood apart from every other weapon in their arsenal, not because it was the most powerful or the most advanced, but because it never quit. It was the one gun that behaved as if the Pacific was its natural home. And in a world where everything else broke, the shotgun that refused to die became a legend.
The Marines who fought their way from island to island in the Pacific quickly learned a harsh truth that every veteran repeated with the same exhausted certainty. Out here, the environment killed weapons faster than the enemy did. Mud was not mud, it was glue. Sand was not sand, it was powder, ground so fine by volcanic winds that it slipped into metal like smoke. Saltwater did not wash off, it burrowed deep into steel and began corroding the moment it touched a surface. On Cape Gloucester, the mud swallowed men up to their knees. Marines pulled their boots free with a sickening slurp, only to find their rifles coated in a thick black sludge that turned every moving part into a grinding mess. On Tarawa, the coral sand was so soft and so fine that it seeped into rifles even when wrapped in ponchos. On Saipan and Tinian, the heat rose until sweat poured down on weapons like rain and carried salt into the smallest cracks. Machine guns cooked their own lubricant off, bolts seized, extractors failed. Even the most respected American weapons struggled. The Garand, rugged and proven, sometimes refused to cycle after a wave crashed over the gunwale of a landing craft. The Thompson choked when grains of sand slipped under the bolt. The M1911 pistol tolerated filth better than most guns, but even it could not escape saltwater forever. The BAR, powerful though it was, often needed 2 men just to keep it clear during extended beach assaults. But the Marines soon discovered that one weapon ignored all of it: the Ithaca 37. At first, they did not understand why. They only knew that the shotgun continued firing when everything else turned into dead weight. Then they examined the weapon closely and realized its strange advantage. The Ithaca ejected shells straight downward through the loading port. That meant the receiver was almost fully enclosed. There was no side ejection port where sand could blow in, no open slot for mud to pack into, no gap to catch the tidal spray of an incoming wave. In a place where the environment searched for any weakness, the Ithaca offered none. Marine armorers noticed this quickly. Other weapons came to them jammed, corroded, or grinding with grit, but the Ithaca needed only a wipe down and a fresh shell. It was as if the designers, decades earlier, had unknowingly built it for a war that had not yet begun. Put a Garand in the surf and you had to strip and clean it. Put a Thompson in the sand and you had to pray it would run. Put an Ithaca 37 in the mud and it would still cycle with a single pump. Marine testimonies from the Pacific are filled with disbelief. One infantryman on Bougainville described how he fell into a water-filled shell crater. His gear soaked, his hands shaking. He racked the Ithaca out of instinct, expecting it to jam. Instead, it fired cleanly, and he wrote later that the gun sounded like it was laughing at the mud. Another Marine told a story from Tarawa. He hit the surf, waves smashing against him, sand blasted by machine gun fire all around. His rifle jammed almost instantly, but the shotgun on his back stayed loaded. With one movement, he racked it, water spilling out of the barrel, and fired at a bunker ahead. The report shook him more than the explosion. Soaked, half-blinded by salt water, the gun still worked. On Cape Gloucester, Marines conducted their own unofficial torture tests. Some pushed the Ithaca into the mud until only the buttstock stuck out. They yanked it free, splashed water over the chamber, pumped it once, and pulled the trigger. The shotgun blasted a spray of pellets into a tree stump as if nothing had happened. They tried again with sand, burying the barrel in the beach. It still fired cleanly. They ran it through mangrove swamps, fell on it during night patrols, dragged it through volcanic ash, and still it refused to die. In their informal evaluations, Marines used a simple phrase: "It works no matter what." The Ithaca's few moving parts meant fewer points of failure. The steel was sturdy enough to resist bending in cramped jungle fighting. The pump action was smooth, almost impossibly so, even when dripping with seawater. Marines discovered they could cycle it with a single finger when slick with jungle rain. The buckshot rounds it fired turned close combat into a storm of pellets that shredded foliage, shattered wooden defenses, and dropped enemies instantly in the confined spaces of caves and bunkers. And every time a Marine fired the Ithaca after it had been coated in mud or soaked in salt water, his confidence grew. A weapon you could trust in the Pacific was not just a tool, it was a lifeline. Marine squad leaders began requesting more of them. Raiders asked for them specifically during night raids. Engineers clearing bunkers with satchel charges demanded the Ithaca because they knew the gun would fire at point-blank range even after crawling through mud-filled trenches. Recon teams carried it because it survived being dragged through rivers and slammed against rocks. In a war fought across some of the harshest terrain on Earth, the Ithaca stood apart because it was indifferent to that terrain. The Pacific broke men. It broke machines. It broke morale, but it never broke the Ithaca. To the Marines, that meant everything.
By the middle years of the Pacific War, American Marines had learned the brutal rhythm of fighting the Imperial Japanese Army. The enemy did not surrender. They did not retreat from fortified positions. They fought from tunnels carved into volcanic rock, from bunkers buried beneath coral, from caves filled with darkness thick enough to swallow a man whole. In those places, rifles were too long, machine guns too heavy, and pistols too weak. The Marines needed a weapon that hit like a hammer at arm's length and fired as soon as it was raised. That weapon was the Ithaca 37. Nothing prepared a Marine for his first assault on a Japanese bunker. The air inside was hot, stale, and filled with the stench of sweat, gunpowder, and rotting earth. The passageways twisted like veins, forcing men to crouch or crawl. Enemy soldiers hid behind corners, recessed pits, and narrow choke points where even the smallest hesitation meant death. In such places, the shotgun was not just effective, it was decisive. Marines who carried the Ithaca knew exactly what they were holding. In open jungle, it was a weapon. In caves and bunkers, it was a force of nature. A single blast of buckshot at 5 or 10 yards delivered a shockwave no rifle on Earth could replicate. It filled corridors with lethal metal. It ripped through wooden shields, bamboo walls, and thin steel plating. It stunned enemy soldiers with noise alone. At Peleliu, engineers clearing underground strongpoints described the Ithaca as the key that opened the island. They would toss a satchel charge into a tunnel entrance, hear the muffled blast below, and then descend with the shotgun raised, rack sliding silently in the dark. The first Japanese soldier who moved into the faint glow of a flashlight beam received a full spread at close range. The pellets shredded him and smashed into the walls behind in a storm of sparks and dust. One Marine wrote after the battle, "Peleliu was a place where the shotgun felt like a gift from heaven."
Inside the twisted cave networks of Okinawa, the Ithaca earned a reputation that spread across the entire division. Marines went into tunnels so narrow they had to turn their shoulders sideways to move forward. They carried flashlights in one hand and the Ithaca in the other. When a shadow shifted ahead, when a bayonet flickered in the dark, when a Japanese soldier lunged from a side passage, the shotgun answered in an instant. No hesitation, no jam, no wasted motion. Just the violent roar of buckshot in a space barely big enough for two men to stand. Night raids amplified these strengths even further. Marine raiders who specialized in silent approaches often carried Thompsons or rifles until the moment the fight began. But when a raid turned chaotic, when the darkness filled with shouts and muzzle flashes, they relied on the Ithaca. The pump was nearly silent when worked slowly. The muzzle blast in close quarters blinded the enemy. The spread guaranteed hits even when visibility dropped to nothing. On Bougainville, a raider patrol slipped into a Japanese encampment at night. When a sentry spotted them and raised the alarm, the first Marine in line fired his Ithaca into the tent. The spread dropped 3 soldiers instantly. The patrol fired again and again as they retreated into the jungle, their shotguns lighting the night like thunder in a storm. The shotgun's psychological impact was undeniable. Japanese soldiers were trained to charge, to scream, to surge forward in sudden waves. But the first blast of buckshot inside a tight space often broke their momentum. The concussion alone stunned them. The wide pattern cut through multiple men and shredded morale as effectively as bodies. In captured diaries, Japanese soldiers wrote of the terrifying American shotgun that killed with one thunderous blow. But the effectiveness of the Ithaca was not only in its raw power. It was in how naturally it fit the Marine way of war. A Marine clearing a bunker needed to keep moving. He needed to push in, fire quickly, and dominate the space. The Ithaca was short enough to maneuver, light enough to carry with one hand, and powerful enough to end a fight in an instant. There was no awkward bolt to operate, no long barrel to catch on walls, no heavy drum or magazine to slow him down. Even the pump action became part of the rhythm. Marines described the feeling as almost comforting. Rack, fire, rack, fire. Each motion smooth, instinctive, unstoppable. The gun seemed to encourage aggression. It drove men forward instead of holding them back. On Iwo Jima, the close-quarters fighting reached its terrible peak. Marines climbed into caves carved from volcanic ash, smoke swirling, grenades rolling in front of them. They fired at enemies just feet away, often too close to aim properly. In one account, a Marine dove into a shallow trench to escape fire from a cave entrance. A Japanese soldier rushed him with a bayonet. The Marine brought up his Ithaca and fired from the hip. The blast lifted the attacker off his feet. The Marine pumped the shotgun and fired again before scrambling to new cover. These stories traveled faster than official reports. They spread through fire teams and platoons until every Marine understood that if you were going into a bunker, if you were entering a cave, if you were fighting at night in tight terrain, you wanted the Ithaca 37 at your side. In the Pacific, there were no neat front lines, no long-range exchanges, no clean engagements. The war was often fought face-to-face in the shadows of jungles and tunnels, and in those dark, brutal spaces, the Ithaca 37 was king. It was the weapon that turned corners into death traps for the enemy, the weapon that brought crushing force into places where rifles and machine guns struggled to operate, the weapon that Marines trusted when they stepped into the black unknown ahead.
By late 1943, the Marines had learned that the Ithaca 37 was not just a rugged shotgun. It was a specialist's tool, a weapon that seemed perfectly tailored for the elite forces who did not fight like conventional infantry. Raiders, recon patrols, scouts, snipers, and underwater demolition teams all found themselves drawn to the same conclusion. When you moved in the shadows,
When you landed under darkness, when you slipped behind enemy lines with the ocean at your back and a knife between your teeth, the weapon you trusted was the Ithaca. Marine raiders were the first to embrace it fully. Their missions demanded speed above all else. They carried only what they could run with, because raids were measured in minutes, not hours. Every ounce slowed them. Every bulky piece of gear cost precious time. A Thompson was powerful but heavy. A Garand had reach but was awkward in tight spaces. The Ithaca fit the raider philosophy perfectly. It was compact, light, and devastating at the ranges raiders fought in. On the island of Bougainville, a raider platoon prepared for a night infiltration against a Japanese supply camp. They wore camouflage smeared with mud and charcoal. They carried grenades, satchel charges, and knives. But the men chosen to breach the perimeter carried shotguns, and every one of them asked for the Ithaca 37. The reason was simple. The pump was nearly silent when worked slowly. The weapon could be held close to the body during stealth movement. And when the moment came to break the silence, the first shot from the Ithaca hit with the force of a cannon. As the raiders crept through the brush, rain dripping from mangrove branches overhead, the Ithaca carriers led the line. When they reached the first tent and a startled Japanese soldier emerged, the raider in front fired once. The blast lit the night, and the man fell instantly. Within seconds, the raiders surged through the camp, the rhythmic pumping of the Ithaca echoing in the chaos. In the after-action notes, a sergeant wrote, "The Ithacas led the way. Every tent they hit fell immediately." Far from the jungles, recon units discovered their own reasons to trust the shotgun. Marine reconnaissance patrols often operated far from friendly lines with minimal support. They had to move silently across riverbeds, climb cliffs, slide through brush, and crawl for miles without raising attention. They needed a weapon that could fire after being dragged underwater, through mud, or slammed against rocks. They needed something that worked every single time without question. The Ithaca delivered. One recon Marine described how his team approached a Japanese listening post hidden in thick undergrowth on New Georgia. The team crossed a waist-deep creek in total silence, water climbing over their gear. Their rifles were held high to keep them dry, but the shotgun carriers simply let the Ithaca dip below the surface. When they reached the far bank and saw movement in the foliage, the recon lead cycled the shotgun once, water pouring out of the barrel, and fired. The weapon answered without hesitation. For the rest of his life, he swore that no other gun on Earth could have done that. Underwater demolition teams, the predecessors of the Navy SEALs, also became unexpected admirers of the Ithaca. Their missions were brutal and dangerous. They dove from rubber boats in heavy surf, swam through breakers, planted explosives on coral obstacles, and scrambled onto beaches under machine gun fire. Their gear was battered by waves, smashed against rocks, and soaked in saltwater. Most weapons jammed immediately after such abuse. The Ithaca often worked on the first pump. UDT operators told stories of hitting the sand after a rough swim, gasping for air, and hearing the angry rattle of a Japanese machine gun above them. Their rifles useless with water trapped in the barrel. Their pistols half clogged with grit. But the Ithaca could be racked once, sending seawater streaming from the muzzle, and fired into the nearest bunker or tree line without pause. It became the tool they trusted to carve out breathing room in those first terrifying seconds on the enemy beach. The shotgun also found a home with Marine engineers, who often worked under the most intense close-quarters conditions of the entire war. They carried dynamite, flamethrowers, wire cutters, and heavy tools. They crawled into trenches and crawled out again. They waded through mud that reached their belts. They ran through smoke and debris while setting demolition charges. They needed a weapon that did not snag on equipment, did not jam when dropped, and did not require delicate maintenance. The Ithaca hung across their chests like a steel guardian, always ready, always reliable.
One engineer clearing a network of trenches on Saipan described how he fell into a waist-deep pit filled with muddy water. His gear submerged, his helmet ripped from his head. Japanese soldiers shouted somewhere ahead. He rose, pumped the Ithaca, and fired at a shadow moving toward him. The gun fired cleanly, blasting mud from the barrel. Later he said, "That shotgun saved me before I caught my breath." Even officers and squad leaders began carrying the Ithaca during assaults on dense terrain. They prized it for its ability to regain control in a sudden ambush or to blast through a concealed enemy position with a single decisive shot. And because the shotgun was so compact, leaders could carry binoculars, maps, radios, and other essential gear without being weighed down. But more than any technical advantage, the Ithaca offered something Marines valued even more: predictability. In the Pacific, almost nothing was predictable. Rain fell for days. Heat rose until sweat poured from helmets. Weapons rusted overnight. Mud and mold grew on boots, uniforms, and ammunition. But the Ithaca did not care. It fired the same after a monsoon as it did after a dry night. It fired after being dropped in the surf. It fired after being dragged across volcanic sand. For radar and recon units, for UDT teams, for engineers and assault troops, the Ithaca became not just a weapon, but a companion, one that weathered the Pacific with them, endured everything they endured, and never once failed them. In a war defined by chaos and hardship, the Ithaca stood for one thing these men desperately needed: reliability in the face of the unknown.
When the Pacific War finally staggered to its bloody end, the Marines who returned home carried more than scars and memories. They carried stories of the few things that never failed them in a world designed to break them. The Ithaca 37 was one of those rare constants, a weapon that had survived everything the Pacific threw at it and had protected its users with the same stubborn determination they showed on every beach, ridge, and jungle trail. Long after the shooting stopped, men who had crossed Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, Okinawa, and the countless unnamed islands in between spoke of the Ithaca with a kind of quiet reverence. They did not talk about its engineering. They did not mention its lineage or its designer. They talked about the moments it saved them, the moments when they pumped the action, expecting failure, and instead heard the clean, metallic click of the bolt locking forward. The moments when mud dripped from the barrel or saltwater streamed off the receiver, and the gun still fired as if the Pacific had never touched it. The Ithaca's legacy began in those personal stories. A Marine rifleman from Okinawa told his grandson decades later that the Ithaca 37 was the only weapon he trusted when entering a cave because it never lied to him. A raider from Bougainville kept his issued shotgun in his home until the day he died, saying, "It watched over me once, it can watch over me again." An engineer from Saipan remembered cycling the shotgun with trembling hands after being thrown into a crater and realizing the gun was ready before he was. These were not exaggerations. They were the reflections of men who had measured their survival against the reliability of their equipment. And in the Pacific, no weapon earned more trust in close quarters than the Ithaca 37. Its legacy did not end with World War II. The same qualities that made it invaluable in the Pacific made it exceptional in every conflict that followed. When the Korean War erupted, American forces again faced brutal winters, mud thick enough to trap vehicles, and close-quarters trench fighting. Soldiers and Marines carried Ithaca 37s into frozen bunkers and snow-choked valleys, confident that the weapon would fire no matter how harsh the climate. The same downward ejection that protected the gun from sand now kept it clear of snow and ice. During the Vietnam War, the Ithaca found new life in the hands of Marines patrolling dense jungles and Navy SEALs conducting night raids in the Mekong Delta. SEALs especially favored the shotgun because of its rugged simplicity. They moved through swamps, rivers, and mangrove forests where many weapons rusted shut or clogged with mud. But the Ithaca continued to function even after being submerged in brown river water filled with silt and vegetation. Many SEALs called it the one gun you could depend on when everything else jammed. Back in the United States, police departments adopted the Ithaca for its reliability and easy handling. Prison guards carried it, highway patrolmen used it. Security forces guarding nuclear facilities and government installations chose it because it simply did not fail. By the late 20th century, it had become one of the longest-serving pump-action shotguns in American history, a design so fundamentally sound that it barely changed across generations. But among the Marines of World War II, its reputation was deeper than durability. It became part of their identity, not because it was glamorous or famous, but because it was always there. The Garand won the long-range battles. The Bar held the line. The Thompson offered a river of bullets. But the Ithaca walked with the men who crawled through darkness and mud. It was the companion of the scouts who moved silently at night, the partner of the engineers who cleared bunkers, the guardian of the raiders who hit enemy camps at midnight, and the reassurance of every Marine who feared that his rifle might fail when he needed it most. Photographs from the Pacific tell the story silently. A Marine climbing onto coral rubble with an Ithaca slung across his chest, a raider in mangrove roots gripping an Ithaca in one hand and a knife in the other, a recon Marine emerging from a river, water streaming off his helmet, holding the shotgun above the surface, a flamethrower operator covered in soot with an Ithaca beside him, ready to clear any survivor in a cave. These images show a truth that official reports cannot. The Ithaca 37 was not a sidearm. It was not a backup. It was a front-line tool carried by men who needed the simplest, most reliable force possible, in places where the terrain and the enemy tried relentlessly to kill them. In the end, the Ithaca became a legend, not because it fired the loudest shot or the farthest shot, but because it fired every shot. It represented trust, the rarest commodity in war. When the monsoon rains fell, when the surf slammed the beaches, when the mud swallowed boots and rifles and hope, the Ithaca remained unchanged. It stood between life and death in conditions where almost nothing else could. Its legacy lives in museums, in veteran stories, in the doctrine of special operations forces, and in every modern shotgun descended from its design. But its true legacy lives in the memories of the men who carried it onto beaches of black sands, through jungles choked with vines, into caves that smelled of death, and across coral ridges lit by fire and rage. To them, the Ithaca 37 was more than a weapon. It was a promise that in the worst place imaginable, when every other piece of steel failed, the shotgun would not. It became the quiet hero of the Pacific War, a lifesaver in the shadows, a companion in the storm, and a legend that Marines would never forget.